Hello again, Mr. Salavati. The poem I chose to do my final summative on is In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. I chose this poem because it is a poem that we grew up listening to. Every Canadian should listen and cherish this poem as it depicts the sacrifice and hardships that Canadian soldiers endured so that we could live happy lives as Canadians in modern society. The poem was written by Lieutenant Colonel John Alexander McCrae. He was born on November 30th of 1872. McCrae was a physician and soldier during the First World War. To cope with the mental stress of the war, McCrae found peace through literature, particularly poems. McCrae was a helpful young man throughout the war. He used his expertise in physiology to rejuvenate many falling soldiers. He also served time on the battlefields, so it is safe to say that he understands the hardships of battle. Also, McCrae was not outgoing. He kept a small circle of friends throughout his service. One of his dearest friends was Lieutenant Alex Helmer. After the death of Helmer in May of 1915, McCrae felt scared, helpless, and alone. At the funeral of his friend, Lieutenant Helmer, John sat near the poppy fields and wrote the poem, In Flanders Fields. Little did he know that this poem would be a revolutionary Canadian symbol for the First World War. Now let's listen to the poem.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead short days ago. We lived the dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields, in Flanders fields. And now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields, in Flanders fields, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields, in Flanders
This poem is about Flanders Fields, a battleground located in Belgium between East Flanders and West Flanders. This battleground was where many Canadian soldiers lost their lives. In these fields, small flowers called poppies grow. These poppies have become Canadian symbols and can be seen worn by people all over Canada towards the beginning of November. In the poem, McCrae attempts to tell his audience about the hardships of war and how the soldiers in the First World War risked their lives every day. He goes on to ask future generations to carry on their duty and obligation to their country. We see this when he says, "To you from falling hands, throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high." As I listen to this poem now, I cannot help but remember the short story Diamond Necklace. McCrae wants this war to end as he has had enough. He does not want to live his life with the fear of death, which he cautiously awaits. This is evident when he says, "Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky." This implies that he too, one day expects that he will be buried under a cross in Flanders Field. Although her situation may not be of life and death, Madame Louis Selle in the diamond necklace also wishes nothing more than to be out of her situation of poverty. This situation proves to be very hard for her. We see this when the author writes, "Hard labor has made her unhappy, weak, and has taken toll on her beauty." This poem can relate back to the story of Man Descending too. In the short story, Man Descending, the protagonist wants nothing more than his wife to love and acknowledge him. Similarly, John McCrae wants people to remember all the soldiers that had fallen and acknowledge their service. We see this message conveyed in the last few lines of the poem. So, when John McCrae writes, "If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep." This is a request to his audience to never break faith with the soldiers that had fallen, to love and respect them as they loved and respected their country. So this story and poem is broken down into 3 stanzas, which are further broken down into 5 lines, which goes to the next stanza, which is 4 lines, and back to the final stanza, which is 5 lines. Each stanza conveys a somewhat unique message, but it all ties together well. So in the first stanza, McCrae stresses the importance and significance of Flanders Field. The next stanza describes the veterans and their struggles. And the poem finishes off with a humble request to the audience in the final stanza. The mood of this poem remains dismal and sad throughout, since McCrae was touched by the death of his friend while writing the poem. Also, taking into consideration that McCrae was totally against war, I feel that his tone was very appropriate. Moving on, there are a number of literary devices depicted throughout the poem. To begin, we can look at a metaphor on line 12. McCrae compares a torch to the duty that the deceased soldiers are passing on to the living. This is significant because it ties together the whole poem in an adequate manner. There are also a number of symbols in the poem. For instance, the poppies symbolize the deceased soldiers. It is a common legend that blood shed from the soldiers on the battlefield paint the poppies red. On line 4, we find another symbol, larks. Oftentimes, people interpret larks as people who have courage and perseverance to carry on through tough situations. Lastly, the torch. The torch symbolizes duty and obligation. There are a number of key themes in the story. These include passing the torch, the courage to move on, and killing the future. The courage to carry on and persevere is also a major theme in Timothy Finley's novel, The Wars. The protagonist is required to persevere through many hardships like war and the death of his beloved sister. This poem is rich in literature, despite the fact that it wasn't written by a professional, but instead someone who was trying to write to pay homage to a dear friend. McCrae never intended for this poem to reach such significant measures, but the deep meanings, the literary devices, and overall messages of the poem make this poem a true work of literary genius. People have listened to this poem for generations and will continue listening to it, lest we forget the martyrs of the Great War.